Hello, I'm Andy Shoemaker, and I'm the founder of NimbusDDOS. And this is a re-recording of a presentation, a booth presentation that I did at the 2019 RSA conference in San Francisco. And the topic for this presentation is DDoS certification. Now, DDoS Preparedness certification is something that we feel very strongly about at NimbusDDOS. And my hope is that some of the information in this presentation can be useful and people can take it back to their own organizations and help them improve their own security posture. And certainly if you have any questions about this presentation or about NimbusDDOS, by all means feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is on this first slide. Now, before I get started, I'm going to give a kind of a quick 30-second version of my CV and tell you a little bit about NimbusDDOS. So like many security experts, I would say that my own experience started in the more gray areas of security. I remember launching my first denial of service attack back in 1995. And since then, it's been an area of both personal and professional interest. Now, my professional career before NimbusDDOS was focused on online operations. And I've worked for numerous consumer-oriented online brands, including TripAdvisor.com, MTV Games, and one of the larger online casino and poker properties in the world. And as you might imagine, companies like these, they tend to get attacked a lot, and that's where the idea for NimbusDDOS came from. So I mentioned that that's sort of where the idea for NimbusDDOS came from. So let me tell you the story about that. So about a month after I joined one of those companies, they experienced a pretty severe denial of service attack. And although at the time I was the new guy, this wasn't my first DDoS rodeo. And after some digging, it turned out that they really didn't have any meaningful defense against DDoS attacks. So like most companies, we frantically called up a mitigation vendor, and like many companies before and after us, we signed a contract with very, terrible terms, but they were able to mitigate the attack. Then fast forward about 4 months later, and we're getting attacked again. But the mitigation is literally doing nothing. So I'm yelling at the mitigation vendor, they're making excuses, and the executive team at my company is freaking out because they're watching revenue drop as the site's offline minute by minute. And I thought to myself, this is crazy. There has to be a better way than just blindly trusting these vendors. So I started NimbusDDOS on one simple idea, and that was vendor-neutral testing. So every month, companies throughout the world are basically throwing money away on mitigation solutions that may not work when they actually get attacked. So how do we solve this problem? As the slide shows, the first thing is that we have DDoS experts. And I know, every vendor out there talks about their experts. But when I talk about experts, I mean real experts. These are people who can write DDoS attack code from scratch and that have been in the trenches defending against these types of attacks. And then upon that expertise, we then built our own tools to help organizations test their defenses proactively. And I'm not going to go into detail on all of our services, but I will call out two specific ones because they're sort of applicable to the presentation today. The first is our proprietary DDoS testing platform, which we can use to launch any DDoS attack currently seen in the wild. And this platform, it basically allows our customers to launch legal DDoS attacks against themselves, just like a real attacker would. And the key there is so that they can proactively test their defenses. So there's no more sitting idle waiting for an attacker to target your company. The second service that's of note is our DDoS Preparedness certification, and that's the crux of what this presentation today is about. Now, many companies look at DDoS preparedness simply as a mitigation service or an appliance. But the DDoS preparedness landscape is actually much broader, and it extends beyond just a technical solution to DDoS attacks into other important business areas. One such area I tend to call operational capabilities. Now, this is the area where those mitigation solutions that I just talked about, like the on-premise solutions or the cloud mitigation providers, that's where these fit into. But as you can see, there are some other aspects, such as monitoring and alerting, which can be invaluable during an attack. Another area which we routinely see failures in, is incident response. It's extremely common for us to test an organization that already has some mitigation in place, but because of human failures in process and procedure, the mitigation gets delayed. And then the last major area I'll mention is what I call preparedness. And this covers topics of internal and vendor governance, as well as organization staffing and training. So as you can see, being prepared for an attack extends well beyond just having a solid mitigation solution. So what is DDoS preparedness certification, you might ask? Well, it's making sure that all of these areas are covered properly and working in harmony together. So before we talk about what certification is or how certification is done, let's talk a little bit about why we should be DDoS certified. In a nutshell, it's about trust. I'm sure most of the people listening to this, you have customers, and DDoS attacks erode the trust that a customer might have in a business. This is particularly problematic for places like banks. But what about SaaS businesses or ISPs? Wouldn't it be great if those companies could provide evidence to their customers that shows they're prepared for an attack? Now, aside from external customers, most of us also have internal stakeholders we need to make happy. And that may be other business units that depend on the IT organization, or it may be as simple as your boss. A DDoS certification can go a long way to building that internal trust. And lastly, there's the increasing prevalence of formal compliance requirements. And although there's no formal standards from NIST issued yet for DDoS preparedness, those are in the process right now, and there's organizations like the FFIEC that have already started issuing guidance in this area. And we've also been seeing an increase in other jurisdictions as well. And the NimbusDDOS certification framework is built to be ahead of those requirements. So we're sort of planning for the future. So how do we certify for DDoS preparedness? We start by assessing an organization's overall risk classification. And we break this apart into 4 general tiers. And this classification, it's of course a bit subjective, but you can see listed some key areas that we look at when doing this. These are all areas that heavily affect the likelihood that an organization will be attacked and the impact it will have if successful. A good example would be an international bank, which we consider to be a Tier 4 organization. So they have massive revenue, they're in B2C and B2B business models, they're in a high-risk industry sector, so on and so forth. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum is a local independent brick and mortar store, which tend to be very low risk. Now, with the business assigned a risk classification, we then need to look at all those items I mentioned earlier that are in the DDoS preparedness landscape. And in this slide, I've shown the specific areas that we examine as part of the certification. And the print's a little bit small here, so I hope everyone can see it in the video, but if not, please get in touch with me and I'm happy to share this presentation with you. But basically for each one of these control areas, we're looking to determine the maturity level in that area. And to give you an idea for how we assess these areas, I've listed the methods by which we do that. For example, the categories with checkboxes in the yellow column, those are controls that we can test using our NimbusDDOS attack platform. And some of the other areas that are listed, those simply might require a review of documentation or maybe an interview with some key personnel. And I actually want to go off on a little quick tangent here. I mentioned a moment ago that we assess the maturity level of a control. The way we do this is we have a simple 5-level scale. And at the bottom we have 1, which means that there's no control in place. And at the extreme end is a 5, which is a state-of-the-art level of maturity. This would be probably the kind of control that is maybe hypothetical, or maybe it's never even left a lab. Most companies tend to be in that 1 to 3 range. So how does the preparedness landscape, risk classification, and maturity levels all fit together? In essence, the assessment is used to determine the current level of maturity, and that's what's shown in green. The business risk classification is shown in red and represents where the company should be. So this is essentially a gap analysis. So if the green and the red are both in the same box, then everything is great and the maturity matches the requirements. And if the required maturity level is higher, then of course, we have a gap that needs to be addressed. And I'll mention that this specific assessment that is on the screen right here, this was actually done for a Tier 3 organization. And had they gotten all the areas green, then they would have passed. Now, ultimately, they did put some quick remediations in place, and they did receive their Tier 3 certification. So that, in a nutshell, is what DDoS Preparedness certification is all about. And my hope is that some of this information has been useful and that you can maybe now go back with some of this high-level information and consider what DDoS preparedness might look like within your own organization. And certainly if anyone listening to this has any questions about DDoS certification or DDoS testing, or would like a copy of the slide deck, or would just like to chat about this stuff, by all means, please feel free to reach out to me with any of my contact information on this slide. Thank you all.